Hey, everybody! Welcome to another episode from Your Own Pathway Leadership and Mental Well Being. For those who don't know me, my name is Payavu. I'm a licensed psychotherapist and trauma informed leadership consultant. And I help leaders realign to their values to rebuild trust because leadership isn't just about performance, it's about how power impacts people. So let's own it. Happy March. I am recording this episode in March. And first of all, I want to say happy March. We made it. And March is also Women's Month, International Women's Month. And I decided that for leadership and mental well-being, your own pathway episodes, that I'm going to focus on women in leadership and the progress that we have made, and still a lot of the barriers that we are seeing, especially in leadership. So, before we celebrate the representation, I want to ground us in reality. So, according to the 2025 Fortune 500 data, currently in 2025, 55 women currently serve as CEOs. So that's about like roughly 11% of Fortune 500 companies. And of those 55, only two are Black women. So across the broader C suite, women hold about 29% of executive roles. And is this progress? Yes. Is it parity? No. But representation alone does not tell us the full story because we also need to examine something deeper about all of this. So, not just who is appointed, but when. And all the data and research that I'm referencing today in this episode will also be included in the description box below. So, let's talk about something called the glass cliff. And I've heard about this, but I really didn't understand the nuances of what the glass cliff is. We heard of the glass ceiling, but what is the glass cliff? So, the term glass cliff was first introduced in 2003 by researchers named Michelle Ryan and Alex Haslam. And this is at the University of Exeter. So, what did their research find? Their research found that women were significantly more likely to be appointed into leadership roles when organizations were already performing poorly. So, what does this mean? They were not appointed during growth, they were not appointed during stability, and especially they were appointed during declines. So, why does this distinction matter? It matters a lot because the glass ceiling blocks access to leadership. The glass cliff grants access, but under unstable conditions. You are elevated, but the ground beneath you is already eroding. And if the organization continues to struggle, well, the failure becomes personalized, not structural. And that is the cliff right there. And so in 2026, this remains relevant because while representation has indeed increased, the pattern of when women are elevated still reflects structural inequality. So, moving on, let's ask the critical question. If women of color are fully capable of leading thriving organizations and have clear examples that hey, why are they disproportionately elevated when systems are already unstable? Is that actually equity or is that risk transfer? Because equity distributes opportunity. Risk transfer concentrates burden. And that distinction matters. So when Failure makes systems open minded, and we've seen this a lot. When organizations are stable and are thriving and doing well, leadership continuity is preserved. It often feels like the sameness feels very safe. But when things begin failing, such as stock decline, morale collapse, reputational damage, suddenly we hear, oh, we need fresh perspective, or we need new leadership. We need something different. So, difference becomes acceptable during crisis. And this is not always during prosperity. This is actually reactive inclusion, not structural inclusion. And reactive inclusion often comes with compressed timelines. So, moving on, I want to talk next about the timeline distortion. So, if dysfunction accumulated over 10, 15, or even 20 years, that's cultural erosion. That's governance avoidance. That is ethical misalignment. That is financial instability. The thing is, ideally, you cannot reverse that in 2 or 3 fiscal cycles. But often, when a woman of color steps into crisis leadership, the expectation is immediate stabilization. And when rapid transformation does not occur, what happens? The narrative can quietly shift to, oh, we gave her a chance, but what exactly was being evaluated? The leader or the unrealistic expectation that years of erosion could be repaired instantly? If foundational instability took a decade to develop, expecting reversal in 24 months is not strategic. It is projection, and projection protects systems from deeper accountability. I want to talk about this theme of what hero projection is. And so, when a woman of color is appointed during times of instability and collapse, something subtle happens. The system shifts into rescue mode. And this rescue mode can sound like, oh, she's going to fix this, or she represents change, or she'll stabilize everything. That right there is hero projection. What it does is it concentrates responsibility to one individual, but the leader cannot single handedly reverse governance delay, cultural toxicity, ethical avoidance, financial decline. So, when responsibility is concentrated instead of distributed, burnout risks increase. And when visible progress doesn't match compressed expectations, leadership rotates instead of systems reform. And unfortunately, that protects the structure, not the leader. And so, as I'm saying all of this, as someone who used to do therapy as a psychotherapist, and, as I'm saying all this, it kind of reminds me of a pattern that I see in a lot of my clients and even my own journey also is the pattern of women of color will recognize is, especially in immigrants and intergenerational trauma systems, is usually being the oldest daughter. And so, as I'm saying all of this, it reminds me of being the older daughter of a immigrant family or generational family, where the oldest daughter often becomes the translator, the mediator, the stabilizer, the generational bridge, the overfunctioner. And The thing is, she did not create the dysfunction, she inherited it. And yet, she is expected to repair all of this. And when she is unable to repair all of this quickly enough, more responsibility is added. So, organizations sometimes assign women of color the same over concentrated repair role. So, capacity becomes expectation, expectation becomes pressure, pressure becomes a silent burden. And that is not empowerment, that is burden redistribution disguised as opportunity. So part of my work is looking at the system lens. And as I'm talking about this, I talked about the, older daughter of an immigrant family too, and how much of women of color in leadership roles um, have the same parallels. And another parallel that I wanted to demonstrate very much in a systems level is family systems. In family systems therapy, we often see decades of, dare I say, dysfunction brought into the room. And in that room, there is an expectation that, oh, we'll fix all of our generational dysfunction in a few sessions. Or when repair requires time, this won't take much time. The thing is, repair requires time, lots of time. It also requires containment, regulation, accountability, structural honesty. So organizations are no different from family systems because leadership change is not a magic wand. It is an entry point into repair. So I want to give an example of this and talk about Lisa Su at AMD. So when she became CEO in 2014, AMD was very much struggling. They were facing declining market shares, financial pressure, competitive instability, and this was not a ceremonial succession. It was a very high risk leadership moment. And under her leadership, AMD reconstructed, they innovated, and they rebuilt investor confidence, which significantly improved long term performance. Yes, turnaround is possible. Yes, capability is not the issue, condition is. Structural backing matters, governance alignment does matter, and timeline realism matters. And so I want to talk about the governance, like accountability. When early warning signs are ignored, such as internal dissonance, ethical fractures, cultural instability, those are signals. And not only do they escalate, they also um, become turnover. Unfortunately, they can become lawsuits, they can become public controversy, and they can also become reputational damage. And often, it is at the breaking point that leadership finally diversifies, but the diversification during scandal is reactive. What structural inclusion does is it must precede collapse, not just follow it. So, moving on, I want to talk about what real inclusion actually looks like. If representation increases primarily during crisis, we must ask, are we actually practicing equity or are we redistributing the risk? Because structural inclusion looks like women of color leading during profitable divisions, succession planning during stability, shared responsibility for reform, realistic timelines, for repair, governance accountability alongside executive accountability. Inclusion must be structural, not just symbolic. And so I hope this episode was helpful. And I want to close off by saying that the glass cliff is not about whether women of color can lead. They can. But the real question is, are we actually building systems that distribute responsibility? Or are we building systems that concentrate it? So, if this conversation made you reflect on that, on the questions to ask and the examples and issues that were brought up, if this episode at all made you slightly uncomfortable, whoever chooses to watch this, I really want you to sit with it and really reflect where the reform, where reflection on where reform actually begins. Leadership is not just about optics. It is structure, it is integrity, it is timing, and it is shared accountability. So that is all I have for you all for this week for leadership and mental well-being. And as always, lead with alignment, lead with regulation, lead with accountability, and especially lead with integrity and own it. I will see y'all next time. Take care. Bye.